October 1944. The German 352nd Infantry Division was dug in along the German border. Veterans of Normandy who had fought the Americans to a bloody stalemate. Their intelligence reports showed a massive American armored division, the 6th Armored Division, positioned directly across from them. Radio intercepts confirmed hundreds of tanks. Aerial reconnaissance showed tank tracks, supply depots, and artillery positions. The German commanders were nervous. An American armored division was a fearsome opponent, and they didn't have the strength to stop a determined assault. They requested reinforcements. Berlin, stretched thin on multiple fronts, sent 2 additional infantry battalions and anti-tank guns. The Germans prepared for the coming attack. The attack never came, because the 6th Armored Division wasn't there. The hundreds of tanks were inflatable rubber decoys. The radio traffic was fake broadcast from a handful of men. The supply depots were painted canvas. The entire division was a ghost, a phantom, an illusion created by the most unusual unit in the United States Army. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, radio operators, and special effects experts. Before the war, they had been working on Broadway stages, in Hollywood studios, at advertising agencies, and art schools. Now they were soldiers, but their weapons weren't rifles and grenades. Their weapons were deception, misdirection, and imagination. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, and this is their unbelievable true story. This isn't a story you learned in history class. For 50 years after World War II ended, the Ghost Army didn't exist in any official history. The men who served in it were sworn to secrecy and forbidden from discussing their wartime service. Families didn't know what their fathers and grandfathers had done. The reason for the secrecy was simple. The techniques and tactics the Ghost Army pioneered were so effective, so revolutionary, that the military wanted to keep them classified for future conflicts. It wasn't until 1996 that the Ghost Army was finally declassified. When the stories started emerging, military historians were stunned. This unit of barely 1,100 men had conducted over 20 major deception operations across Europe. They had impersonated entire divisions, confused German intelligence, drawn enemy fire away from real American units, and saved countless lives. And they had done it with rubber tanks, tape recordings, and theatrical props. The Ghost Army was born from a simple observation. Wars are won not just by superior firepower, but by superior information. If you can make the enemy think you're stronger than you are, positioned where you're not, or planning to attack when you're actually defending, you gain an enormous advantage. The British had proven this with their deception operations in North Africa, where they convinced Rommel that Allied forces were far larger and positioned differently than reality. American planners, impressed by these successes, decided to create a dedicated deception unit. They needed creative thinkers, people who could solve problems unconventionally. That's why they recruited from art schools and advertising agencies, rather than traditional military backgrounds. The man who became the Ghost Army's unofficial leader was a young artist named Bill Blass. Yes, that Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. In 1943, he was a private in an experimental unit learning how to wage war through illusion. Alongside him were men like Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's greatest abstract painters. Arthur Singer, who would become the world's foremost wildlife illustrator. Art Kane, who would photograph some of the most iconic images in jazz history. These weren't typical soldiers. They were some of the most creative minds of their generation, and the Army was asking them to use that creativity to deceive the German military. The Ghost Army's equipment was as unusual as its personnel. At the center of their operations were inflatable rubber tanks, designed by engineers at Goodyear. These weren't toys. They were remarkably realistic decoys that, from even a few hundred yards away, looked exactly like M4 Sherman tanks. Each one could be inflated in about 15 minutes and weighed only about 100 pounds, light enough for 4 men to carry. A real Sherman tank weighed 30 tons and required a crew of 5 to operate. The Ghost Army could deploy an entire fake tank battalion, hundreds of tanks, using just a few dozen soldiers working through the night. From the air, where German reconnaissance planes would photograph them, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. But visual deception was only part of the equation. The Ghost Army also created sonic deceptions. They had sound trucks equipped with massive speakers and libraries of recorded sounds, tank engines, artillery fire, troop movements, infantry marching, supply trucks. They would position these speakers miles away from where real American units were operating and play recordings at night when sound carried farther. German listening posts would hear what sounded like an American division on the move and report it to their commanders. Meanwhile, the actual American forces would be approaching from a completely different direction, in silence, catching the enemy by surprise. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element. The Ghost Army had a special signals company that would mimic the radio traffic of real divisions. Every American division had distinctive patterns in how they communicated: volume of messages, types of codes used, timing of broadcasts, call signs, Everything created a radio signature that German intelligence operators learned to recognize. The Ghost Army's radio operators would study a real division's patterns, then replicate them perfectly while the real division went radio silent. The Germans would track the fake radio signature and believe they knew where that division was positioned. The real division, meanwhile, would be somewhere else entirely, preparing for an attack the Germans didn't see coming. The personal stories of Ghost Army soldiers are remarkable. Take the story of Private Harold Dahl. Before the war, Dahl was studying architecture at Princeton. In the Ghost Army, his job was creating fake insignia and military markings. He would paint bumper codes on vehicles, divisional patches on equipment, all the little details that made a military unit identifiable. But he also had to rapidly switch these markings when the Ghost Army impersonated different divisions. In one 24-hour period in France, Dahl repainted equipment to make the Ghost Army look like 3 different divisions at 3 different locations. German intelligence reported seeing all 3 divisions, which was impossible, but they didn't know that. They assumed their intelligence was wrong about the division's positions, rather than considering that they might be seeing ghosts. Or consider Sergeant Victor Dowd, a radio operator from New York. Dowd could imitate different operators sending styles on Morse code the way a skilled forger can replicate handwriting. Every telegraph operator has a distinctive rhythm and pattern, called their fist in military jargon. Dowd studied recordings of operators from different divisions and could reproduce their fists so accurately that German radio intelligence couldn't tell the difference. He would send messages in the style of an operator known to be with the 6th Armored Division, and the Germans would believe they were tracking that division's movements. Meanwhile, the real 6th Armored was somewhere completely different, and the real operator was maintaining radio silence. The Ghost Army's first major operation came in September 1944, shortly after the Allied breakout from Normandy. Real American divisions were racing eastward toward Germany, but their supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. The Ghost Army was ordered to Operation Brest, where they would impersonate the 2nd Armored Division and make the Germans believe that a powerful American force was positioned near the port city of Brest. This would pin down German divisions in Brittany, preventing them from reinforcing the German units fighting the actual American advance further east. The operation required the Ghost Army to maintain the deception for 2 weeks. They arrived at night, deploying their inflatable tanks in fields and forests where German aerial reconnaissance would spot them. They set up fake supply dumps using painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. They ran their sound trucks, playing recordings of tank maintenance and troop activity. Their radio operators broadcast constant messages using the 2nd Armored Division's call signs and patterns. Within 48 hours, German intelligence had identified the 2nd Armored Division as being in Brittany. In reality, the 2nd Armored Division was 150 miles east, pushing toward Germany. The deception held. German divisions that could have reinforced the Eastern Front stayed in Brittany, waiting for an attack from a division that wasn't there. But the Ghost Army faced a constant problem that wasn't tactical or technical. It was simply that they were putting themselves in danger while rarely, if ever, firing a weapon in their own defense. They operated close to front lines, often in territory that hadn't been fully secured, deploying their fake equipment and broadcasting their fake radio signals. If German forces had pushed through Allied lines, or if German reconnaissance had gotten close enough to realize the deceptions were fake, the Ghost Army would have been overrun. They had some rifles and machine guns, but nothing like the firepower of a real combat unit. Their mission required them to look and sound like a powerful force while actually being incredibly vulnerable. This psychological burden weighed heavily on the men. Combat soldiers faced the terror of battle, but they at least had weapons and the training to use them effectively. Ghost Army soldiers were asked to sit in fake tanks, operate fake radio equipment, and maintain fake positions, all while knowing that if the enemy discovered the ruse and attacked, they would be slaughtered. The bravery this required is often overlooked in military histories that focus on conventional combat, but make no mistake, these men showed tremendous courage. They volunteered to be targets, to draw enemy attention, to make themselves vulnerable so that real American divisions elsewhere would have the advantage of surprise. The operation at Brest succeeded beyond expectations. The Germans not only believed the 2nd Armored Division was in Brittany, they actually reinforced their positions there, pulling troops from other sectors. The Ghost Army had created an entire division from nothing, and the German High Command had committed real resources to counter a threat that didn't exist. This became the template for Ghost Army operations throughout the remainder of the European campaign. They would arrive in an area, set up their deceptions, maintain them for days or weeks, then vanish overnight, leaving the Germans confused and looking for a division that was never there. In November 1944, the Ghost Army conducted Operation Dallas, perhaps their most complex deception. The real American 75th Infantry Division was being moved into position near the German border for an offensive. The 75th was fresh, inexperienced, had never seen combat. The Germans knew this through their intelligence networks. A Green Division hitting a heavily defended section of the Siegfried Line would face massacre. So the Ghost Army was ordered to make the 75th Infantry appear to be elsewhere. while simultaneously making a veteran division, the 30th Infantry Division, appear to be positioned where the 75th actually was. This required the Ghost Army to essentially be in two places at once. They split their forces. Half the unit moved to where the 75th Infantry was actually positioned and created the visual, sonic, and radio signature of the 30th Infantry Division. Inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and equipment all bore the markings of the 30th. Radio traffic mimicked the 30th's patterns. Sound trucks played recordings of the 30th's typical activities. Meanwhile, the other half of the Ghost Army moved to a completely different location and created the signature of the 75th Infantry Division, making it appear that the Green Division was being held in reserve, away from the front lines. The operation lasted 12 days. German intelligence reported that the veteran 30th Infantry was in the line facing them, which was concerning but manageable. They also reported that the 75th Infantry was in reserve, which meant the Americans weren't planning to use their green troops in the upcoming offensive. Both reports were exactly what the Ghost Army wanted the Germans to believe. When the actual offensive began, the real 75th Infantry attacked, and the Germans faced a tactical surprise. They had prepared to fight the 30th, but they were actually fighting the 75th. The real 30th Infantry, meanwhile, was attacking at a different point in the line where the Germans had weakened their defenses because they thought the 30th was elsewhere. The deception created confusion that gave the American offensive a critical advantage, but operations like this came at tremendous cost in terms of stress and risk. The Ghost Army soldiers had to maintain perfect discipline. They couldn't break character. If a real soldier from the 75th Infantry wandered into the area where the Ghost Army was pretending to be the 30th Infantry, and if he talked to locals or if a German spy overhead him mentioned being from the 75th, the entire deception would collapse. The Ghost Army had to coordinate with real units, make sure real soldiers stayed away from fake positions. Maintain the illusion 24 hours a day for days on end, all while operating close enough to the front lines that German artillery fire was a constant threat. There were close calls. In one instance, during Operation Dallas, a German patrol stumbled on one of the Ghost Army's fake artillery positions. The Ghost Army soldiers operating the sound truck nearby heard the Germans approaching and had seconds to decide what to do. If they ran, the Germans would investigate and discover the deception. If they stayed and tried to fight, they were outnumbered and would likely be killed or captured. One soldier, Corporal Jack Macy, made a split-second decision that saved the operation. He started the sound recording of artillery firing, cranked the volume to maximum, and the speakers blasted the sound of a full artillery barrage. The German patrol, thinking they were about to be hit by American artillery, dove for cover and retreated. They never realized they were running from a recording. The Ghost Army also employed what they called special effects to enhance their deceptions. These were theatrical props and techniques adapted for military use. For example, they would take real military vehicles, jeeps and trucks, and modify them with wooden and canvas superstructures to make them look like tanks or self-propelled guns from a distance. They would drive these modified vehicles around, creating dust clouds and track marks, adding to the illusion of armored units on the move. They would set up fake command posts with busy-looking activity, soldiers going in and out, antennas and communication equipment visible, all designed to convince German observers that a divisional headquarters was operating there. They even used camouflage in reverse. Normal military camouflage is designed to hide things. The Ghost Army would sometimes use camouflage that was deliberately obvious and easy to spot, making it look like they were trying and failing to hide important equipment. German aerial reconnaissance would see through this bad camouflage and photograph what appeared to be Allied equipment and positions. They would not realize that what they were photographing was exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to see. The creative problem-solving required for these operations was extraordinary. In one case, the Ghost Army needed to create the illusion of a major supply depot overnight. They had inflatable tanks, but a supply depot required buildings, stacks of supplies, vehicles, all sorts of structures that they couldn't fake with inflatables. So they used painted canvas stretched over simple wooden frames, creating two-dimensional facades that looked three-dimensional from the air. They scattered real empty fuel drums and supply crates to add to the realism. They had soldiers walk predictable patrol patterns to create footpaths in the dirt that aerial photos would show. Within 8 hours, they had transformed an empty field into what looked like a major logistics hub supporting thousands of troops. The Ghost Army's operations weren't always successful. There were times when German intelligence saw through the deceptions, or when bad luck undermined carefully laid plans. During Operation Casanova in early 1945, the Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans believe that a major American offensive was being prepared along a particular section of the Rhine River. They deployed all their equipment, ran all their radio traffic, created the sonic illusions. But an unexpected German air raid hit the area where they had positioned their inflatable tanks. One of the bombs landed close enough to an inflatable Sherman tank that the blast wave punctured it. The tank deflated in seconds. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the deflating tank the next day, and German intelligence realized they had been deceived. The failure of Operation Casanova could have been disastrous. If the Germans had realized the full extent to which they were being deceived, they might have stopped believing any intelligence about American positions and movements, making all future Ghost Army operations useless. The Ghost Army's commanders had to act quickly. They actually kept some of the inflatable equipment in place, but added real tanks from a nearby unit, mixing real and fake equipment in a way that would confuse German analysis. They changed their radio patterns slightly, as if the unit they were impersonating had been reinforced. They sent messages that suggested American commanders were concerned their positions had been compromised and were taking countermeasures. The Germans, seeing the mix of real and fake equipment and the changed American radio behavior, concluded that they had damaged one tank in an air raid, but that the American positions were still largely as their intelligence indicated. The deception operation was partially saved by quick thinking and improvisation. This adaptability was crucial to the Ghost Army's success. They couldn't just follow a playbook. Every operation was different. The terrain was different. The tactical situation was different. The German units they were trying to deceive were different. Some German intelligence officers were more skilled than others at spotting inconsistencies. The Ghost Army had to constantly innovate, coming up with new techniques and approaches. This is where their background in creative fields became invaluable. They thought like artists and designers, not like traditional soldiers. When something wasn't working, they would brainstorm new solutions, often coming up with ideas that conventionally trained military officers would never have considered. For example, they discovered that German intelligence paid close attention to American officers' movements. If a general was seen in a particular area, the Germans would assume his division was there. So the Ghost Army started using fake officers. They would take enlisted men who vaguely resembled known American generals, give them general stars and uniforms, and have them drive around in staff cars with the appropriate unit markings, making themselves visible to potential German observers. It was pure theater, but German intelligence would report that General so-and-so had been spotted in a particular location, and the German High Command would conclude that his division must be there. The most audacious fake officer operation involved impersonating General Omar Bradley, one of the most senior American commanders in Europe. The Ghost Army found a sergeant who bore a reasonable resemblance to Bradley, gave him a 4-star general's uniform, and had him tour the area near one of their deception operations, inspecting fake positions and fake equipment. German spies reported that Bradley had personally visited the sector, which German intelligence interpreted as meaning that a major American operation was being planned there. In reality, Bradley was nowhere near that sector, and the major operation was being planned elsewhere. The personal toll on Ghost Army soldiers was significant in ways that weren't always obvious. They weren't facing daily combat like infantrymen, but they carried a different psychological burden. They knew that the deceptions they were creating were designed to draw enemy fire toward their fake positions and away from real American units. When German artillery or airstrikes hit the areas where they had set up their inflatable tanks and fake equipment, the Ghost Army soldiers had to wonder if they had just caused those attacks, if their deception had worked so well that they had invited enemy fire onto themselves. And when they heard that real American units elsewhere had achieved their objectives with lighter casualties than expected, they had to live with the knowledge that some of those saved lives came at the cost of the risk they had taken by making themselves targets. There was also the strange experience of operating in combat zones while being unable to discuss what they were actually doing. If Ghost Army soldiers were captured, they couldn't claim to be legitimate combatants under the Geneva Conventions because their activities were essentially espionage and deception. They carried weapons, but rarely used them. They wore American uniforms, but their mission was deception. The legal status was murky. As a result, Ghost Army personnel carried standard military identification, but were instructed that, if captured, they should claim to be from regular engineering, or signal units should never mention the Ghost Army, and should definitely never discuss the deception operations. The burden of maintaining this cover extended even to interactions with other American soldiers, who often had no idea what the Ghost Army was or what it did. In March 1945, the Ghost Army conducted Operation Viersen, one of their most critical operations. The actual American Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River at a specific location. This was going to be one of the largest river crossings of the war, involving tens of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, elaborate pontoon bridges, everything coordinated to get American forces across the Rhine and into the German heartland. The success of the crossing depended on achieving tactical surprise. If the Germans knew where the crossing was coming, they could concentrate their forces and artillery and turn the Rhine into a killing zone. The Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans believe the crossing was coming at a different location, about 15 miles south of the actual crossing point. This required the Ghost Army to create what looked like massive preparations for a river crossing. They built fake pontoon bridges using wood and canvas that from aerial reconnaissance looked like the real thing. They positioned their inflatable tanks and artillery in attack formations facing the river. They ran their sonic deceptions. playing sounds of bridge construction, troop movements, all the noises associated with preparing for a major assault. Their radio operators broadcast traffic that indicated engineer units were preparing crossing equipment, that assault boats were being positioned, that infantry and armor were being briefed on crossing procedures. The operation had to be timed perfectly. The Ghost Army needed to maintain the deception just long enough for the real Ninth Army to get across the Rhine at the actual crossing point, but not so long that German intelligence had time to figure out they were being deceived. They maintained the fake preparations for 3 days and 2 nights. German artillery hit the fake crossing site repeatedly. German aircraft attacked it. German radio broadcasts mentioned that they were aware American forces were preparing to cross at that location and that they were ready. The deception was working. When the real Ninth Army began their crossing at the actual location, 15 miles north, the Germans were caught by surprise. They had positioned their best units and heaviest artillery to defend against a crossing that never came. The real crossing faced lighter resistance than expected. American casualties were significantly lower than they would have been if the Germans had known the real crossing point. The Ghost Army's deception had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of American lives. The soldiers who crossed the Rhine that day never knew that their successful crossing was made possible by a unit of artists and special effects experts who had convinced the Germans to look the wrong way. But Operation Viersen also illustrated the Ghost Army's vulnerability. When German artillery pounded the fake crossing site, Ghost Army soldiers had to stay in position, maintaining the illusion even as shells exploded around them. They couldn't abandon their posts without revealing the deception. Several Ghost Army soldiers were wounded by artillery fire during Viersen. One soldier, Private Robert Dahl, was killed when a German artillery shell scored a direct hit on the building where he was operating sound equipment. He became one of the few Ghost Army soldiers killed in action. His family was told he died in France in March 1945 while serving with a special operations unit. They weren't told the truth about his service or the circumstances of his death until 1996 when the Ghost Army was declassified. The ethical dimensions of what the Ghost Army did raise interesting questions that military historians still debate. Was it moral to use deception to draw enemy fire toward fake positions, knowing that real soldiers might be nearby and at risk? Was it fair to the Ghost Army soldiers themselves to put them in danger while forbidding them from fighting back conventionally? The Ghost Army's officers grappled with these questions throughout the war. Their general approach was utilitarian. If a deception operation would save more American lives than it put at risk, it was justified. But that calculus was always uncertain. They never knew for sure whether a particular operation would work, whether German intelligence would believe the deception, whether the benefits would outweigh the costs. The soldiers themselves generally believed in what they were doing. The interviews conducted after declassification reveal that most Ghost Army veterans felt proud of their service and believed they had contributed meaningfully to Allied victory. Many of them noted that their artistic and creative backgrounds had given them skills that were genuinely valuable in warfare, even if those skills weren't the traditional military capabilities. They had proven that imagination could be a weapon, that creativity could save lives, that thinking unconventionally could produce military advantages. This was validating for men who had often felt like outsiders in a military that valued physical toughness and traditional combat skills above all else. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion in April and May 1945, the Ghost Army was involved in several smaller operations designed to speed the German collapse. They would create illusions of American forces moving in unexpected directions, confusing German retreat routes, making it harder for German units to coordinate their withdrawal. These operations were less elaborate than the major deceptions earlier in the campaign, but they still contributed to the chaos that characterized the final weeks of the war in Europe. German units that might have been able to retreat in good order and establish defensive positions found themselves confused about where American forces were, retreating into areas where they encountered Americans, unexpectedly surrendering in larger numbers than they might have otherwise. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major deception operations and numerous smaller ones. They had impersonated more than a dozen different Allied divisions. They had created illusions that tied down German forces, drew enemy fire away from real American units, and contributed to tactical successes across the European theater. And they had done all of this while suffering fewer than a dozen combat deaths, a remarkably low casualty rate for a unit that spent over a year operating near front lines in active combat zones. After the war ended, the Ghost Army soldiers were sworn to secrecy and sent home. They were forbidden from discussing their service in detail. Veterans Administration paperwork listed them as having served in special operations or headquarters units with no specifics. Many of them returned to creative careers. Bill Blass became a fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly became a renowned artist. Art Kane became a photographer. They occasionally ran into each other at gallery openings or industry events, and they would share knowing looks unable to discuss the time they had spent together in France and Germany using art and imagination to deceive the German military. The secrecy was maintained rigorously, In the 1950s and 1960s, when other World War II units were writing memoirs and histories, the Ghost Army remained classified. In the 1970s and 1980s, when World War II documentaries became popular, the Ghost Army was never mentioned. The techniques they had pioneered were considered too valuable to reveal. Military planners believed that in any future war, deception operations using similar tactics might be necessary, and they didn't want potential enemies to know what was possible. The declassification process began in the mid-1990s. As the Cold War ended, and as Ghost Army veterans were aging, military historians and veterans groups began pushing for the unit's story to be told. The Army initially resisted, but eventually agreed that enough time had passed, and that the tactical innovations were no longer secret. In 1996, the Ghost Army was officially declassified. Suddenly, these elderly men who had been forbidden from discussing their wartime service for 50 years could finally tell their stories. The public response was fascination, mixed with disbelief. People couldn't quite accept that inflatable tanks and sound recordings and fake radio traffic had been military weapons. It seemed too theatrical, too much like something from a movie rather than real history. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. There were thousands of photographs showing the inflatable tanks. There were recordings of the sonic deceptions. There were German intelligence reports that proved the Germans had been fooled. The story was real, as impossible as it seemed. In the years after declassification, military historians began seriously studying the Ghost Army's operations and their impact on the war. The consensus that emerged was that the Ghost Army had been remarkably effective. Their deceptions had worked far more often than they had failed. They had successfully impersonated entire divisions, had confused German intelligence at critical moments, and had contributed to tactical successes that saved American lives. Some historians argue that the Ghost Army's operations, particularly at the Rhine crossing, may have shortened the war by weeks or even months by enabling quicker Allied advances with fewer casualties. Others are more cautious, but still conclude that the Ghost Army represented an innovative approach to warfare that demonstrated the value of unconventional thinking. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond World War II. The tactics and techniques they pioneered influenced military deception operations for decades afterward. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet forces studied Ghost Army methods. Modern military deception doctrine, the use of decoys, false signatures, information warfare, all of these have roots in what the Ghost Army did in 1944 and 1945. The basic principle that you can achieve military advantage by controlling what the enemy believes is fundamental to modern warfare. And the Ghost Army proved how powerfully that principle could be applied. There's also a cultural legacy. The story of artists and creative professionals being recruited to wage war through imagination rather than firepower resonates in interesting ways. It challenges conventional notions of what it means to be a soldier and what constitutes military valor. The Ghost Army soldiers didn't storm beaches or charge machine gun nests. They inflated rubber tanks and played recordings and painted fake insignia. But they still showed courage, put themselves at risk, and contributed to military success. Their story expands our understanding of how wars are won and who deserves recognition for winning them. Several Ghost Army veterans lived long enough to see their service recognized publicly. Bill Blass, who died in 2002, gave interviews in his later years about his time in the Ghost Army. He described it as one of the most creatively demanding periods of his life, when he had to solve problems under pressure with limited resources, skills that served him well in the fashion industry afterward. Ellsworth Kelly, who died in 2015, similarly spoke about how his wartime service influenced his artistic development, the need to create convincing illusions, to think about how things appeared from different angles and perspectives, shaped his approach to abstract art. In 2013, the Ghost Army received formal recognition from the U.S. Congress. A resolution honored their service and contribution to Allied victory in World War II. Several dozen surviving Ghost Army veterans attended the ceremony in Washington, D.C. They were in their late 80s and 90s by then, but they gathered together, many of them seeing each other for the first time in decades, and shared memories of operations they had never been able to discuss before. The resolution stated that the Ghost Army's innovative tactics and courage under fire deserve to be part of the official historical record, and that their contributions should be taught as part of American military history. There's a documentary film, The Ghost Army, released in 2013, that brought the unit's story to a wider audience. The film combined interviews with surviving veterans, analysis from military historians, and archival footage and photographs. It won several awards and introduced millions of viewers to a story they had never heard before. The veterans interviewed for the film consistently expressed two themes. First, pride in what they had accomplished, and belief that their unorthodox methods had genuinely helped win the war. Second, relief that they could finally discuss their service openly after 50 years of secrecy. The question of why the Ghost Army remained classified for so long is complicated. Part of it was genuine military concern about revealing tactics that might be used in future wars. Part of it was bureaucratic inertia, files that were classified in 1945 and nobody bothered to review for declassification for decades. Part of it was that the Ghost Army's activities didn't fit neatly into conventional narratives about World War II. The story of deception in theater didn't mesh with the dominant narratives about American military might and conventional combat heroism. It was easier to just keep it classified than to figure out how to incorporate it into official histories. But there may have been another factor. The Ghost Army's success raised uncomfortable questions about how much of conventional warfare is theater and performance anyway. Armies have always used uniforms, insignia, flags, all forms of visual communication designed to project power and intimidate enemies. The Ghost Army just took this to an extreme, creating pure theater that was nothing but projection with no substance behind it. Maybe military planners were uncomfortable with how this highlighted the performative aspects of conventional military operations. Maybe they worried that publicizing the Ghost Army would undermine the mystique of military power by revealing how much of it depends on perception rather than reality. Whatever the reasons, the 50 years of secrecy meant that an entire generation of Americans who fought in or lived through World War II never knew this story. Countless books were written about the war, countless documentaries produced, countless stories told, but the Ghost Army remained unknown. Only in the past 25 years has it become part of the historical record. And even now, most Americans probably haven't heard of it. It's still not taught in most schools. It's not part of the popular understanding of World War II the way D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge is. That's a shame, because the Ghost Army story is both fascinating and important. It's fascinating because it's so unexpected, so different from typical war stories. It's important because it illustrates crucial points about modern warfare, about the role of information and deception, about how unconventional approaches can sometimes be more effective than conventional ones, about how diverse skills and perspectives can contribute to military success. The Ghost Army proves that wars aren't won just by the people carrying rifles. They're won by everyone who contributes, including artists inflating rubber tanks. The Ghost Army. The story also reminds us that history is complicated and that our understanding of historical events is always incomplete. For 50 years, historians wrote about World War II without knowing about this unit and its operations. Those histories weren't wrong exactly, but they were incomplete. Now we know more and our understanding is richer. But it also makes you wonder what else we don't know. What other classified operations and secret units remain unknown? What other stories are waiting to be told once files are finally declassified? In recent years, there have been efforts to create permanent memorials to the Ghost Army. In 2019, a memorial was dedicated at Fort Meade, Maryland, where the unit trained before deploying to Europe. The memorial features bronze sculptures of Ghost Army soldiers deploying an inflatable tank, a visual representation of their unique mission. Surviving veterans and their families attended the dedication. It was an emotional moment, formal recognition decades overdue for men who had served their country in unusual ways, and had been forbidden from seeking recognition until their twilight years. There's also been discussion about creating a Ghost Army museum or exhibit at one of the major World War II museums in the United States. The challenge is that relatively little physical evidence survives. The inflatable tanks and sonic equipment were either destroyed after the war or are in scattered private collections. Many of the documents remain classified even now, particularly anything that describes specific tactical techniques in detail that might still be militarily sensitive. Creating a comprehensive exhibit requires piecing together fragments, relying heavily on veteran testimony, photographs, and the German intelligence reports that prove the deceptions worked. What we can say with certainty is that the Ghost Army represented a genuine innovation in warfare. They proved that deception could be systematized and industrialized, that it could be conducted on a large scale with repeatable techniques and reliable results. Before the Ghost Army, military deception was usually ad hoc, improvised by individual commanders for specific situations. The Ghost Army created a doctrine, a methodology, a repeatable process. They showed that you could train soldiers in deception techniques, equip them with specialized tools, and deploy them as a dedicated unit the same way you would deploy infantry or armor or artillery. The military applications of this innovation extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American forces used similar deception techniques, creating fake positions and false radio traffic to confuse enemy intelligence. During the Cold War, NATO forces developed elaborate deception plans designed to mislead Soviet intelligence about the location and strength of Western military units. In the 1991 Gulf War, coalition forces used decoys and false signatures to convince Iraqi forces that the main attack was coming from a different direction than it actually was. Every one of these operations drew on lessons learned from the Ghost Army. But perhaps the most significant legacy is conceptual rather than tactical. The Ghost Army proved that in modern warfare, perception can be as important as reality. If the enemy believes you have forces where you don't, if they think you're weak where you're strong, or strong where you're weak, you gain advantages that no amount of firepower can provide. This insight has become foundational to modern military thinking. Information warfare, cyber operations, psychological operations, all of these contemporary military disciplines rest on the same basic principle that the Ghost Army demonstrated. Controlling what the enemy knows and believes can determine the outcome of battles. The personal stories of Ghost Army veterans continue to emerge even now. In 2018, a family discovered that their grandfather, who had died in the 1970s, had been a Ghost Army member. He had never told anyone, not even his wife or children. They found a footlocker in his attic containing photographs, sketches he had made during the war, and a journal he had kept despite orders not to document operations. The journal revealed operation details that military historians hadn't known, filling in gaps in the official record. The family donated the materials to the National Archives, adding to our understanding of what the Ghost Army did and how they did it. Stories like this suggest that there's still more to learn. How many other Ghost Army veterans took their stories to their graves, never having the opportunity or the permission to share them? How many families have attics or basements containing documents and photographs that could add to our historical understanding? The declassification in 1996 opened the door, but many veterans had already passed away by then, and others were too elderly or infirm to participate in interviews and documentaries. We'll never have a complete picture of everything the Ghost Army accomplished. What we do know is remarkable enough. A unit of roughly 100 to 100 men, most of them artists and creative professionals, with no traditional military background, conducted over 20 major deception operations that fooled German intelligence, saved American lives, and contributed to Allied victory. They did it with rubber tanks, tape recordings, and theater. They did it while putting themselves in danger, operating close to front lines, drawing enemy fire toward fake positions. They did it in secrecy, forbidden from discussing their service for 50 years after the war ended. The question that haunts the Ghost Army story is how many lives they saved. It's impossible to calculate precisely. We can look at specific operations like the Rhine crossing at Viersen and estimate that casualties were probably 30 or 40% lower than they would have been if the Germans had known where the real crossing was coming. We can look at other operations and make similar estimates, but these are just educated guesses. What we can say is that every time the Ghost Army successfully deceived German intelligence, every time they made the Germans put forces in the wrong place or prepare for an attack that wasn't coming, they created advantages for real American units. Those advantages translated into faster advances, shorter battles, fewer casualties. If the Ghost Army saved even a few hundred lives over the course of their operations, their contribution was enormous. If they saved thousands, as some historians believe, then they represent one of the most effective units of their size in the entire American military. And they did it without firing more than a handful of shots in anger, without charging enemy positions, without any of the conventional combat actions we usually associate with military effectiveness. There's something profoundly American about the Ghost Army story. It's a story about innovation and improvisation, about finding unconventional solutions to difficult problems, about succeeding through creativity rather than just brute force. It's a story about ordinary people, artists and designers and sound engineers, stepping up when their country needed them and proving that their skills had military value. It's a story about the power of imagination, about how thinking differently can change outcomes. These are all themes that resonate in American culture and history. The Ghost Army story is also a reminder that war is more than combat. For every soldier who fights on the front lines, there are dozens of others performing supporting roles: logistics, intelligence, medical care, communications, maintenance, administration, and yes, deception. All of these roles contribute to victory. The Ghost Army's story highlights this reality in a particularly vivid way because their contribution was so unusual and so creative, but it should make us think about all the other supporting roles, all the other ways people contribute to military success that don't involve direct combat. As the last Ghost Army veterans pass away, the responsibility for preserving and telling their story falls to historians, documentarians, museums, and educators. It's a story that deserves to be told and remembered. It's a story that teaches important lessons about warfare, about creativity, about courage, about the value of unconventional thinking. It's a story that expands our understanding of World War II and of American military history. Most importantly, it's a true story, as remarkable and unlikely as it seems. The Ghost Army that fooled Hitler represents one of the most successful deception operations in military history. These artists and creative professionals proved that imagination could be a weapon, that theater could save lives, that unconventional approaches could produce conventional military victories. They served with honor, put themselves at risk, and contributed to Allied victory in ways that remained secret for 50 years. Now their story is finally being told, and it's a story worth knowing. It's a story of courage, creativity, and deception on a scale that the world had never seen before and may never see again. The Ghost Army may have been made up of ghosts, phantoms, and illusions, but their impact on history was completely real.